Hi, this is Robert, and welcome to today's show. Now, thanks to vaccinations, cases of wild poliovirus globally have really dropped dramatically. In the 1980s, the estimated global number of paralytic cases was over 350,000 annually, and the disease was still prevalent in 125 countries. Fast forward to 2018, and there was 33 cases in two of the three remaining endemic countries, that's Pakistan and Afghanistan. So how did we get here? And what are the hurdles left to eliminating polio from the face of the earth? Well, joining me today to discuss the global polio situation, joining me from Geneva is the spokesperson for polio eradication at the World Health Organization. Please welcome Oliver Rosenbauer. Let's go ahead and start with a little bit of history concerning polio and the introduction of the vaccine.
Sure. Polio, thankfully, it's a disease that most of us in North America or Western Europe don't see very much anymore. But as a reminder, it's a devastating disease caused by a virus. There's no cure for it, and it primarily affects children, and the effects are devastating. They're lifelong paralysis, and in some extreme cases, even death. And historically, polio used to cause devastating, indiscriminate epidemics right across the U.S. In the summertime. This disease would just hit a community. Parents would send their children off to school in the morning, and in the evening they would be at home paralyzed and wouldn't be able to move, and nobody really knew where it came from, how to prevent it, and so forth. In fact, there's this saying that at that time in the late 1940s, parents in America were really terrified of two things. One is a potential nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and the other is that polio epidemic befalls on their community. Of course, then in the 1950s, the first vaccine was developed, which was fantastic. This was made possible through the March of Dimes. President FDR, as you know, had polio. He launched the March of Dimes. He encouraged Americans to send into the White House a dime, and so the White House was inundated with envelopes filled with dimes, and that's basically what funded the development of the vaccine, which then became available in the 1950s, and it was really a godsend, if you like, and the disease began to disappear very rapidly from developed countries like the U.S.
And since I am based out of the U.S., when was polio eradicated from the United States?
So polio was officially eradicated in 1979 from the U.S. But thanks to the vaccine, the disease caseload was greatly reduced even by the mid 1960s already. But in terms of the endemic person-to-person transmission, it was successfully interrupted in 1979.
Yeah, and there's 3 strains of wild poliovirus, and only wild poliovirus 1 still circulates. Can you tell the audience about the status of WPV 2 and 3?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you rightly said, there's 3 strains, WPV 1, 2, and 3. There's genetic differences, immunological differences, but in terms of symptomatically, there's no differences between these strains. They cause paralysis in children. WPV2 we haven't seen since 1999, so it's globally eradicated. WPV3 we haven't seen anywhere in the world since 2012. We think it's eradicated. So that leaves basically one wild poliovirus strain, WPV1, and we're only seeing this strain in border areas between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And even there at extremely low levels. And biologically, we're closer than ever to eradicating this disease, because we know that we're knocking out individual serotypes of poliovirus, which tells us we're on the right track. But actually, operationally, this is very important for us because we have at our disposal serospecific vaccines, which can basically zero in on the remaining strain that is still surviving much more efficiently. And so operationally, that for us is a huge benefit, particularly in areas like Pakistan and Afghanistan, where one of our main challenges is reaching children on the move. There's so much population movement. Of course, if you want to vaccinate a child first, you have to find that child. So if you do find that child, you want to then be able to vaccinate that child with the best possible tool that you have available. And the fact that we only have one strain circulating allows us to do that now.
Now, January 13th, 2011, on that date, the last polio case was reported in India. And this is something myself and many others thought we would never see, right? They used to have hundreds of thousands of cases. Any comment on the situation in India?
Yeah, I mean, this was quite an amazing accomplishment. India was by far the technically most challenging place from where to eradicate polio, and the fact that it's been eradicated from there since 2011 really speaks to the feasibility of eradication of this disease. As you rightly said, many people doubted, could it be done given the challenges in the technical challenges in India, and India has shown that it can be done. And if you look at disease eradication, most diseases, as you know, cannot be eradicated for a number of biological or technical reasons. Polio is one of the few that can be eradicated. Worldwide, there's been, I think, 8 disease eradication efforts attempted. One was successful with smallpox. Smallpox was globally eradicated in 1980. 2 are ongoing. One is guinea worm, the other is polio. The others all failed due to technical reasons. In other words, they might not have had a vaccine or another health intervention, or weren't able to do clinical disease surveillance. What India has shown is that polio is technically and operationally feasible to be eradicated. And that means for us that if we fail to eradicate polio, and we're extremely close to it, but if we fail, it won't be because of technical reasons. It will be because we failed to mobilize the necessary political will or societal will. And we will only be able to blame ourselves for the consequences of that failure. And the consequences are very clear. Polio is a highly infectious disease, as you know. It's not going to stay confined in Pakistan and Afghanistan. It is going to come roaring back right across the world, including to the US, where you have vaccination coverage gaps, including here in Switzerland, where we have vaccination coverage gaps. So change the paradigm a little bit, success in India. It's now up to us whether we want to achieve a polio-free world or not.
Yeah, well said. Before we get up to present day, can you talk to the listening audience and explain, there's 2 polio vaccines. One is the oral polio and one is the inactivated polio. What's the difference between the 2 and how are they used?
That's an important question. Indeed, there are 2. One is the oral polio vaccine, which contains a live vaccine virus. It's a weakened vaccine virus, but it's live nevertheless. And it's intended to stimulate an immune response in the child who receives it, but not to cause the paralysis. That's why it's a weakened virus. The inactivated polio vaccine is a killed vaccine virus, so it does not have, it is completely killed off, and it does not contain a live virus. And the 2 have slightly different methods of actions. Both are excellent at providing personal protection, but only the oral polio vaccine actually has a public health benefit in that it not only protects me personally, but it also prevents me from spreading the virus to others should I be infected. Whereas with the inactivated polio vaccine, I'm protected. I won't catch the paralysis symptoms, but I can still spread the virus. And so what we need the oral vaccine in order to eradicate polio. Now, the problem is under certain conditions, the live vaccine virus that is contained in oral polio vaccine can, under certain conditions, mutate. and essentially regain ability to paralyze, and can actually cause outbreaks of the disease it's meant to prevent. This is very rare when this happens. It's then called what we call a circulating vaccine-derived poliovirus outbreak, but it does happen. And so what we have to do is have a strategy in place to first eradicate polio, and then to switch from the oral polio vaccine to the inactivated polio vaccine. And that's been the process all over the world. So for example, in the US, we talked about the indigenous transmission of poliovirus in the US being interrupted in 1979. That was done through use of oral polio vaccine. And here in Switzerland as well, and in Germany and all other countries, we used the oral polio vaccine to eradicate polio. After that, we switched to inactivated polio vaccine because of this risk associated with oral polio vaccine. And that's the process that all countries are going to follow. So for example, India, that we talked about, that's been now polio-free since 2011, is right now in the process of switching to the inactivated polio vaccine.
Right. And so when we do see the circulating vaccine-derived polioviruses, it's typically in populations with very low vaccination coverage?
Exactly. That's how they emerge. It's not so much a side effect of the vaccine per se, in that, as you rightly say, it's more to do with low vaccine coverage in a community that is allowing this vaccine strain to continue to survive and mutate. But the child who received the initial dose of the oral polio vaccine, he's absolutely fine. He wasn't affected by this strain. So the risk factor is low population immunity.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you've been pretty heavily involved in polio eradication in Pakistan, from what I understand. The progress has been really remarkable, obviously. However, as we get closer to zero, which we're aiming for, it seems to be getting a little bit more difficult. Oliver, what are some of the difficulties that we're facing in Pakistan and probably Afghanistan also, right?
Well, but Pakistan and Afghanistan, and these are in the border areas of the two countries, that's really the only place where we're still seeing wild poliovirus cases anywhere in the world. And it's a geopolitically extremely complicated area. You have insecurity in some areas, you have insurgencies through the Taliban, you have lack of infrastructure, you have a tremendous amount of population movements. And coupled with that, we have an eradication program. And what we're trying to do is, as you said, to get to zero cases, and we're trying to interrupt the person-to-person spread of the virus. If you look at Pakistan, 20 years ago, polio virus paralyzed more than 30,000 children all over Pakistan, 30,000 children. This year so far, we've seen 4 cases in 3 districts. That's tremendous progress, but not if you're trying to eradicate the disease. It's a different measure of success. It's kind of a ludicrously high level of success, and the margin of error that we have is virtually none. And what our main, I mean, there's different challenges in Pakistan, but basically the reason why polio survives there is that not enough children have yet to be vaccinated, even though we vaccinated 97% of children. If you're missing a couple of percentage out of a target population of about 40 million children in Pakistan, for example, that still gives the polio virus a chance to survive. And the main challenge that we have in Pakistan and Afghanistan is the tremendous amount of population movement across the border between the two countries. Every single month, so Pakistan and Afghanistan are joined by a border that's about 2,000 miles in length. I'm from Germany originally, that's twice the length of Germany. And every single day, about 50,000 people cross that border at official, but mostly at unofficial border crossings. And every month, that's 1 million people with their families and their children, and finding those children in the first instance to vaccinate. That's so the same. We're seeing the same virus strain being ping-ponged back and forth across the border, and that's the main challenge that we have in that country. Now, the good news is that we saw at the very end in India. We talked about India being polio free now. At the very end, the last remaining reservoir of polio in India was also population movement. If you think about India, across northern India, at any given moment in time, 8 million people are on the move for seasonal migration, labor migration, whatever. 8 million people, that's the size, that's Switzerland, where we are here, always perpetually on the move. And so they instigated some very clear, specific targeted vaccination strategies specifically aimed at reaching population movements. And those same strategies are now being applied in Pakistan and Afghanistan as well.
Very good. Can you address the situation in Nigeria, the third polio endemic country?
That's right. So Nigeria is the third endemic country to wild poliovirus. And there we haven't seen any wild poliovirus since 2016, which is extremely encouraging. So we think that this strain is probably gone from Nigeria and indeed from Africa, which would be a tremendous achievement. There is one area of Nigeria where we continue to have some subnational surveillance gaps. So we're not 100% confident that we would be able to detect polio there, should it still be there. Having said that, the surveillance in that area is stronger than it was in 2016 when we did detect the cases there. That leads us to kind of think, okay, we're cautiously optimistic. Having said that, Nigeria and a couple of other countries of Africa as well are affected by these circulating vaccine-derived outbreaks that we talked about. So Nigeria, there's one in DR Congo is affected, Mozambique as well, and parts of the Horn of Africa. So the fact that wild poliovirus is gone from Africa seems to be gone, or might be gone. I want to be cautious. It would be a tremendous achievement. But I heard it referred to by a colleague here. It's Africa's unfinished success story. That's only part of the story. So we need to also finish with the vaccine-derived outbreaks because they're less virulent than wild poliovirus outbreaks. They don't travel as easily. They don't cause as large outbreaks. They tend to be easier to stop. But nevertheless, these are strains which are currently paralyzing children. And our aim is to make sure that there's no child that is ever paralyzed again by polio, be it a wild or a vaccine-derived poliovirus.
Now, when we look at the weekly reports coming out of the GPEI, there's frequently reports of positive environmental surveillance cultures in Pakistan and Afghanistan and other places. What is that, and how important is that?
It's very important. It's an additional supplementary surveillance tool that we have at our disposal. Basically, you look in the sewage system, and you see if you can isolate poliovirus in the sewage system. Polio only comes from humans. So if you, for example, detect a poliovirus in the sewage system of Islamabad, which is not an quote-unquote reservoir area of Pakistan, you know that somebody had traveled to Islamabad because it comes from a human somewhere. It doesn't appear out of thin air. And so it just tells you that somewhere you still have some vaccination coverage gaps. And it's a hugely important additional surveillance tool, particularly in areas perhaps where we might have some surveillance gaps. We talked about some areas of Nigeria. If we can sample the sewage systems in key urban areas where there's a lot of migration of populations, then that is able to tell us whether or not how confident we are in our surveillance system. So it's very important for us.
Yeah. Last question, and a tough question. Oliver, looking into your crystal ball, where are we going to be in 5 years?
You know, this whole effort was started in 1985 by Rotary International, the civil society and network, and their premise is actually very, very simple. We're a group of Rotarians from the US and Australia who said, look, we have this vaccine. Kids in the US and Australia are not getting paralyzed, but kids in developing countries are. And every child should have the right to be vaccinated against polio. And we talked about the last case from India, a little girl called Ruksa Khatun in January 2011. She's a special little girl who just happened to be born in an area where there is no healthcare infrastructure, and as a result, she wasn't vaccinated. Here in Geneva, I have two young daughters. Here, that's where they were born. It's the one of the strongest public health systems in the world, and I take them to my pediatrician and they're vaccinated against polio. And that's the whole premise behind this effort, that every child has a right to be protected. And we're so close. We are so close. And if you think about what eradication means, if you think about smallpox eradication, in the 20th century, just in the 20th century, smallpox killed more than 500 million people worldwide. That's more than deaths that were caused during all the wars that have ever been fought in human history, including World War I and including World War II. But as a result of the smallpox eradication effort, since 1980, there's not been a single person who died or was even infected by smallpox. And that's pretty tremendous. And that's what we're trying to achieve with polio as well. And it's within our hands to do it. So it's up to us whether in 5 years we want to be able to say, look, there's not ever going to be another child who will ever be paralyzed by polio. But to succeed, we need the ongoing support of the international development community to make sure that we've got the funds to be able to implement the eradication strategies. We need the countries which are still affected by it to remain committed and to implement those strategies. If those two things come together, then in 5 years' time, polio will be gone. There's no reason why we cannot do this.
Fantastic answer. Well, thanks, Oliver Rosenbauer, for your time, your expertise, and thanks for all the great work you're doing over there. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And don't forget to check us out at the website, outbreaknewstoday.com, the podcast, Outbreak News Interviews, which can be found on the website, on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, and Spotify, and the Outbreak News This Week radio show, which is aired Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time in the Tampa Bay area on AM 1380 The Biz, or online streaming at 1380thebiz.com. And check out our social media presence, Facebook at Infectious Disease News, and Twitter at BackDman63. Outbreak News TV is a production of The Global Dispatch. Copyright The Global Dispatch Incorporated, 2019.